And Charlie evidently really loves the book, and he saw the bad documentary that came out on Netflix, and he was raving about the book, and he was saying how disappointed he was in the documentary. And then at one point he asked Rogan if I had been on the show. And Rogan said, yeah, he's been on. He goes, well, what was he like? And my editor and I were just laughing because she had edited my two Charlie stories. But also the Helter Skelter motive is that Manson believed that a race war was imminent.
Right.
It was taking too long to start, so he wanted to frame these wealthy, white, powerful celebrities' killings on Black Panthers to ignite this race war and make it happen first. So it was kind of a double motive. The worst thing you can do is snitch on anybody else. He liked the notoriety he had. He didn't want to be released from prison in '67. He said, this is my home. It's all I've known. I want to be here. And he wouldn't sign his release forms. He begged to stay in.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Saucetown Investor Podcast. I am your host, Matt Cox, and I am incredibly excited to have this guest here in the virtual studio today. Our guest is an award-winning investigative journalist and entertainment reporter whose work has appeared in national publications such as Us, Premiere, New York, The Village Voice, and Details. His book, Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s was published in the summer of 2019. I am joined by the author, Tom O'Neill. Tom, how are you doing?
Great, Matt. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. And where are you joining us from today?
I'm in LA right now, at home, kind of sat in the home office. That's why there's so much crap behind me.
I was going to say, I read the book. I saw how much research went into it, and I can imagine all those folders back there are a gold mine of research.
Yeah, and you're only seeing a small portion of them. They go on forever and ever.
Oh, man, I can imagine. So joining us from the city where this story takes place. So let's bust right into it, Tom. I know you got a limited amount of time today, and I got a lot of questions I'd love to ask you. And I'll just start off, first off, for anybody listening, go get the book. Again, it's called Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. Go get the book. It was, I told Tom off air, it's 560 pages, I think. I read it in probably a week and a half. But let's talk about it a little bit. So back to the beginning of the story here. You get approached about actually writing a magazine piece on the 30-year anniversary of the Manson murders, which was in 1999. How were you approached about the story? And then how did it evolve into this 20-year saga that ultimately culminated in this book?
I just got a phone call. It was a day after my 40th birthday. So don't do the math. But anyway, from my editor who I'd worked with at that point for, I think, 10 years or so at Us Magazine. And everybody at Us Magazine on the masthead, all the editors and senior writers had all left the magazine the year before because Jan Wenner, who owned the magazine, he also famously owned Rolling Stone, had changed the kind of format. He went from a monthly magazine to a weekly. And while as a monthly, it was entertainment, a little bit, I don't like to say tabloidy because I was doing like pretty hard hitting investigative pieces for them, like 55,000 words, but he was shortening the pieces, and reality TV was starting to explode, and none of us wanted to write about Kardashians or Survivor contestants. And everybody at the top shifted over to Premiere, including my editor, Leslie. And the writers had to get an assignment first because I guess of the practices at Premiere, they already had writers. So we had to kind of prove ourselves. And she got in touch with me with just a phone call to say she had an idea for a story for me that would commemorate what was the upcoming 30th anniversary of the crime, which occurred in August of '99. So she called in, I think it was April of, or no, March of 99. And it's funny. I mean, we were friends, and it's all these years later, and she's texting me this morning because Charlie Sheen was on Joe Rogan last week, and he and Rogan talked about the book for about 20 minutes. And we were joking because I did two cover stories on Charlie back in the 90s. And Charlie evidently really loves the book. And he saw the bad documentary that came out on Netflix. And he was raving about the book. And he was saying how disappointed he was in the documentary. And then at one point he asked Rogan if I had been on the show. And Rogan said, yeah, yeah, he's been on. He goes, well, what was he like? And my editor and I were just laughing because she had edited my two Charlie stories. I spent a lot of time with him, about a week for the first cover and then a week for the second cover, which was like 2 years later. And granted, he's done lots of interviews over the years. He's also done lots of drugs. But you would think that if he read the book so closely and if he looked at the documentary where I'm talking quite a bit, something would have clicked. But he had no recollection. But whatever the case, we were just having a laugh about that today. And I always blame her for the kind of detour my life took because it was supposed to be just a 3-month assignment. You turn a story around in 3 months, 5,000 words, and you move on to the next thing. But this thing took over my life for 20 years. And it's a long story. It's in the book, but what began as a kind of silly anniversary story of a horrific crime turned into this all-consuming quest for me to try to figure out the secrets behind that crime and some other notable events of the 20th century that happened either right before or after these murders, ending up in this book 20 years later. So nothing began by plan or design. And I often think if I had it to do over again, I probably would have said no if I knew what was in store for me. Because I mean, it was exciting and stuff, but there was a lot of bleak times during that 20-year period that I was reporting it. It wasn't an easy story to do.
Yeah, and the level of reporting in there is, I mean, we'll get into some of the details of the story and the things that you uncovered, but I know from seeing you in other interviews, your initial reaction when you were approached to do this story was kind of like, what new am I gonna report here? Because America had
Yeah,
been obsessed with these
yeah.
murders for 30 years. There's been countless stories written about it. I mean, even when I tell people about the book, I'm like, guys, you got to read this. They're like, oh, what new is going to be in there? I'm like, you're not going to believe what's in this book. But that is the initial reaction. So when you started, you had this perception that there wasn't going to be a whole lot new to report here. When you started working on this for what was initially, like you said, going to be a 3-month type process to write a magazine article, was there a specific kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, like a holy crap moment where like this thing is way bigger than what I thought I was getting into?
There were a few small ones. And like you said, I told Leslie was her name, Leslie Bell Buzzkirk, when she called, I said, Leslie, I've never read Helter Skelter, the book written about the case that was kind of like the landmark best-selling true crime book of all time by the prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. I said, I've not been interested in it. It's been written to death, sorry about the pun. And she said, but one thing she said to me that was smart was, since when we have this conversation today, when we're finished, just notice, be aware how often you hear Manson's name used as like this cultural signpost to indicate evil. Like he's constantly referenced in news and pop culture and books as, one of the most evil human beings to have existed. And he's really part of a conversation all these years later. So she goes, just start digging into it. And she knew me. And she said, you'll find an angle, because I didn't know what the angle was.
Mhm.
So I was trying to, at the very beginning, talk to people who were part of the story who had never spoken before, because it's such a really a terrifying case. A lot of the witnesses who testified wouldn't do interviews and didn't look for that moment of fame. And, it was a whole different mindset in 69 without social media. People weren't on Instagram or tweeting and stuff. And people were really scared of the repercussions of testifying against this group of killers. So, but now, 30 years later in 99, when I got the assignment, I found that The weird juxtaposition was the movie stars who I'd been used to interviewing at that point for about 20 years as a quote unquote celebrity or entertainment reporter wouldn't get on the phone with me, wouldn't meet with me. The people that knew the victims, the people who were part of Roman Polanski's circle, Sharon Tate's, the other people, it was like a wall of silence went up. And that forced me to go to B and C level actors and stuff who were peripherally involved, and then also to go to try to get people, like I said, witnesses. And I think since so much time had passed, some of the people who might have been frightened were less frightened. I think they also were old and bored, and had nothing better to do. So if some guy says, I can't pay you for an interview because you're not allowed to do that in legit journalism, but I said, I can take you out to a meal somewhere. So a lot of those kinds of people said yes. And I just, long story short, started gathering information that hadn't been reported in the official record. And a lot of that information contradicted the official narrative. And that's when things kind of took a U-turn. And then I started probing into what was possibly misrepresented by police and the prosecutors. Um, what was represented? Could I prove that it was misrepresented? What was true and what wasn't true? And then the bigger question, well, why? Why would they lie about something? We know that the people who committed the murders did them, and they all went to prison for them, most of them. But why did they have to change the story? And that's what kind of took me down this unending rabbit hole of conspiracies and weirdness and people protecting other people. So it just became and it turned into this massive kind of avalanche of new information that I had to sift through and find out what was important and what wasn't. And it's pretty overwhelming and life consuming, but I think it turned out, to result in a pretty good book. And, we were talking before we went on, I'm taking a lot of the loose ends that I didn't get closure on in the first book and trying to tie them up into neat, tidy bows with a second book, which I'm this close to committing to. I still haven't pulled the trigger on it, but it's the kind of story that unfortunately I thought when I published the book in 2019, I'd walk away from it and never think about the subject again, but it stays with you. And, one of the good things is a lot of people have come to me who wouldn't speak to me before, either because they didn't know who I was or what I was doing, or because they didn't know that I was legit. Now I'm getting lots of information from people who are still alive, who were around then, or even more people who just have knowledge about some of the agencies I wrote about, some of the organizations and stuff that was going on then through their own special knowledge or their experience. A lot of them are investigators, people in law enforcement, people in military intelligence, people who worked in Los Angeles and San Francisco where a lot of this stuff took place. So hopefully if I do the second book, it'll be more definitive than the first, because the first one has, one of the criticisms of the first one is I don't, have a final solution. And I didn't want to make something up. I could have exaggerated, made things ambiguous, but I just want to make the book as fact based as possible. Hopefully, the second one, if it happens, will have a lot more closure.
Yeah, that's one of the things I thought about when I was reading it. Was I thought it was more powerful and more, like, I guess my point being, it didn't, none of it comes off like, if you were to take a really hard stance based on some circumstantial or non-confirming evidence, that can come off almost a little bit tinfoil hat. And your take was very
And a lot of
much,
people do that. A lot of people do that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And your take, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would say what the takeaway is, I don't know exactly what happened, but what I do know is the official account that we were given is not what happened. First, is
Yeah.
that a
It happened
fair
differently.
characterization? And then how,
Yeah.
like,
I like to say that, everything I thought I knew about the case, once I immersed myself in it, and the official narrative I found out was wrong, and I could prove it. I could prove what was wrong, what was covered up, and, what was changed. And then what the latter half of the book tried to prove or show was why that was done. And instead of presenting a final kind of analysis, I just present the evidence and a couple theoretical reasons why things might have turned out the way they had. And I've also found, I didn't know that going in so much because I've never been a real true crime person. I wrote one crime story prior to this, which was about a woman who was murdered tragically here in Los Angeles in the 90s, and it was an unsolved murder. A lot more cut and dried and simple, although it was unsolved, but it was just one person's murder. To this day, it's still unsolved. But what I didn't know, and maybe nobody knew then, was this explosion of true crime interest, in podcasts and streaming shows and what you call like armchair detectives and
Yeah.
digital warriors, people who, because of the internet, want to pick up the crumbs that someone like me puts out there and then pursue it. And those people contact me all the time, the ones who are using what evidence I shared to try to take it further. And, a lot of them are insane and, going
Yeah.
off into areas. And I'm like, oh, no, 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 don't do that. I went there. You're wasting your time. But then there are a lot that have turned up stuff that I didn't, and they're sharing it with me. But there's a whole audience of people out there that want to be detectives, and they're housewives and people at home, people from all professions who eat this kind of stuff up for better or worse. I mean,
Yeah.
I've seen it
There's
happen with this Charlie Kirk shooting last Wednesday,
right.
I think it was.
Yeah.
I mean, when you go online and you see the theories and the people that, even though they have a guy in custody who's pretty much admitted it, and there's physical evidence linking him to the weapon, the crime scene, there's a lot of people out there that think that it still is misrepresented and there's a lie going on. It's kind of one of the mixed blessings of having my book out during these times is they always start using my book, referencing my book as a reason not to trust what you're told. And every time something like this happens, it wasn't just the Charlie Kirk shooting, but a week before the news of this poor Ukrainian woman getting murdered in I think it was Charleston,
Yeah.
public transportation. The guy, I didn't know this, until last week, but the guy's sister had released an audio tape of him telling her that he didn't kill the woman that he's on videotape stabbing to death on the subway or bus or whatever that was, but that the government had planted stuff in his head and triggered it. And, all of a sudden I start getting calls and messages and I see my book scales because people just automatically believe it. Now, I'm not looking into it. I don't have the time. I'm guessing the guy's mentally ill.
Hmm.
And, there's been that kind of paranoid narcissism forever where people blame their horrible sociopathy on others or,
Right.
God or the devil or the military. But now people take it so much more seriously. Unfortunately, because of a book like mine, and I mean, I'm glad my book's out there, but I don't want people to, I don't know. I'm just trying to stay out of the fray. But when that kind of stuff happens, so it was that guy and then the Charlie Kirk thing, it just puts my book kind of in the conversation and makes it topical, which I enjoy the fruits of because it means more people read the book, but it's also a little tainted for me because I don't want to be, profiting off the misery of and sadness of others.
Yeah, they start to treat your book like it's the rule as opposed to the exception. Because you uncovered all these things that we weren't told
Yeah.
about, that means everything
Yeah.
has a conspiracy behind it, when in fact most
Yeah,
things
yeah,
probably
and,
are as they seem.
right, and I try to say my book is very nuanced, and I say very clearly in the book, "Hey, this isn't proven. I'm trying to prove this, and I'm still trying to
Yeah.
prove it, and it sure looks like this might have happened." But a lot of people take what's in there and say that I've absolutely proven that Charles
Hmm.
Manson was programmed by the CIA before the murders to go out and do this stuff, and I've never said that. I said it's a theory, and it's something I believe is possible, but I have not proven it.
Okay, so let's get in just real quick. Vincent Bugliosi is probably, aside from Manson, he's probably the central character of this story. He wrote the official account, and he was the prosecutor in the case. Shouldn't leave that part out. He wrote the official account, which is the book Helter Skelter. Just out of, for our audience, if you just Google Helter Skelter, or if you've read the book, but essentially the theory that was pushed is just that Manson and these crazy hippies went and killed these people because he was mad at a gentleman by the name of Terry Melcher. It was a very clean and easy explanation. Bugliosi,
Well,
who
there were
you
2 actually that he was angry at Terry Melcher, who was a record producer and the son of the singer and actress Doris Day, but also the Helter Skelter motive is that Manson believed that a race war was imminent, but it
right,
was taking too long to start, so he wanted to frame these wealthy, white, powerful celebrities' killings on Black Panthers to ignite this race war and make it happen first. So it was kind of a double motive. And, there were elements of truth to it, but Bugliosi also wildly exaggerated it and embellished it. And, one thing I say in most interviews is I believe that the women who killed for Manson, his followers, and a few of the men did believe in this helter skelter, about to happen. But I don't believe Manson ever did, and that he used that to manipulate and control his followers. And one of my biggest regrets about this is, I really thought I read everything that Bugliosi had ever said about the case from the time he got assigned it in November of '69 until he died at 16. But what I missed was a Penthouse interview he gave in the set where he told the interviewer that he never believed that Manson believed in the motive, that he was too smart and too wily. And he basically believed what I just said, that it was something he used to control his followers with. Now, if I had known Bugliosi had said that, then the natural follow-up question would have been, then why were the murders committed if not to ignite the race war? And unfortunately, by the time I found the interview, he was alive. But at that point, we were in litigation. I mean, he was not talking to me and threatening to sue me and trying to stop
yeah.
my book from being published by writing letters to the publisher,
Wait,
threatening
so
me in all kinds of
I
crazy
gotta,
ways.
Tom, let me ask you, because so that interview you uncovered was in the 70s, and Bugliosi spends the rest of his life basically pushing that this Skelter narrative is the truth, and he profits immensely off it. The book, he becomes kind of a, minor celebrity because of it. So why would he just go on this interview and say something different? Do you think he was like, it was a moment of weak, like, why would he go on there and say that?
Well, it was you know what it was? Again, I'm embarrassed myself why I never asked him that question. I think it was because at the time that, I had a lot of access to him in the first 3 years,
Mhm.
much to his regret in the long run. But I think it was because I wasn't really questioning that part of it so much. I wish I had asked him myself because if he had said that to me, I know I would have followed up. But the Penthouse interview was one of those, you don't see them anymore, really long interviews,
Mhm.
like 10,000 words. They went really deep in the weeds. And they got to the point where they were talking about how smart, not book smart or education smart, but how
Charismatic.
Manson was a con man, a really good, and the interviewer said, "How could Manson believe?" I mean, part of the Helter Skelter theory was that he had found this magical hole in the desert, and he was going to protect his family, hide them in this pit in the desert until the two races had wiped each other out on the planet, and then they'd reemerge from the hole and repopulate the planet with Manson's perfect children, and the blacks who were going to be the victors of the race war would all immediately become the Manson family slaves. And in the river, and he had convinced his followers that in this magical pit, there were streams of honey and trees of fruit all underground beneath the desert. And the interviewers said, "You don't believe that Manson really believed that." And Bugliosi said,
Mm.
no, he didn't believe it. And again, this another part that he said it a second time right before he died. He gave an interview to a Rolling Stone guy, and he said the exact same thing to the Rolling Stone guy. And the Rolling Stone guy, who I actually like, I talked to him a few times after I read the interview because at that point Vince wasn't speaking to me and I couldn't ask him. And he asked the same question, and Vince said, "I never thought that Manson believed that." And the Rolling Stone guy didn't say, "Well, then why were the murders committed if it weren't to start a race war?" Um, and I got in touch with him because I wanted to see whether he did ask him. He just had cut it out of the story because it wasn't a good answer. And, but he said, no, no, there was no follow up. And then he was kind of embarrassed when he realized, contextually how important that would have been. And now
So you
Vince is
think
dead, so we'll never know.
yeah. So you think Vince, it was just the course of a long, you said 10,000 word interview, and he just started speaking candidly and just didn't even
Yeah,
realize
and the
that he was
Rolling
kind of
Stone was too.
he was
Yeah,
contradicting his own personal narrative, and he just probably didn't even think
yeah,
twice about it.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So
yeah.
and no, I want to ask you about another key character in the story is Terry Melcher. And you gave the official narrative around what Terry's involvement in the murders was, at least according to the prosecution. And there's some really explosive stuff in the book. Maybe just tell the story, actually, if you don't mind, about what the prosecution says Terry was doing after the murders versus what you found out Terry was doing after the murders.
Yeah, so in the official narrative, Terry had met Manson in 1968 once at Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boy drummer's house. Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boy drummer, who was the wildest Beach Boy, really the only genuine Beach Boy, a guy, the only one of the brothers or cousins who actually surfed and lived that kind of surfer lifestyle. He got involved with Manson, let the family move into his house. Basically, he enjoyed, having sex with a whole bunch of girls. And after a month or so, they wouldn't leave the house and he couldn't stay there anymore. They were too destructive to his lifestyle. So he moved out of the house. So Melcher met them once at the house. And then a second time, he met him with Dennis again when Dennis had picked him up and driven him home from a club. But then he didn't meet him again until a year later when he went to the Spawn Ranch twice, 2 days in May or June of '69 to audition the family as possible recording artists, and he was not impressed. And he thanked them for, welcoming him there and playing for him, but he just said, I don't think this is going to work out. And that was supposed to be the end of it. Well, what I found in evidence files that I got access to, and again, this took, 2 or 3 years for me to first get access to the DA's files, the police files, and Vince's own interview notes. I found, I think it was 3 or 4 different witnesses who said, no, Melcher was involved with the Manson family. First of all, much more in 1968. A group of them have moved into the house with Melcher and lived there, which became the eventual murder house. He had moved out when the murders happened, but he was there till a year before. And Melcher was having a sexual relationship with a 16-year-old girl in the group, Ruth Ann Melcher. No, excuse me, Ruth Ann Morehouse. And then after the murders, 3 different witnesses talked about Melcher coming to see the Manson family first at the Spawn Ranch and then way out in Death Valley, which takes like 6 hours just to get to where the family had migrated to after the murders. And then even when you get there to get up to the Barker Ranch at the top of this mountain, done all the switchbacks, it takes about 40 minutes to drive up there. So it was a big effort, but Bugliosi covered all that up and then allowed Melcher, because he knew this information, it's in his own handwritten notes, to lie on the stand, which is not just that Melcher was perjuring himself, but since the prosecutor knew it was perjury, it was called suborned perjury, which meant Vince could have been prosecuted for that too.
Hey
So that
guys,
was
we're taking a quick break, but before we get back into it, if you're enjoying this episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us to keep bringing you more valuable content. And if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, don't forget to leave a review. Please, it makes a huge difference. All right, let's get back to it.
So that was kind of one of the explosive events in the book when I find this information. And first I confront Melcher with it, who threatens to throw my briefcase off of his roof and sue me with his army of attorneys. And then in the same breath, he says, why don't you just forget this stupid story and why don't you be my official
Right.
biographer? Because people have been asking me to write a book about, his mother was the #1 film actress in the 1950s. And they all want to know about my mother and Sammy Davis, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin. That was she was part of that crew for a while. And he
Mhm.
said to me, he goes, there's so much people don't know about Doris, his mother. And you could tell that story with me. And I said, Terry, that sounds a lot like a bribe or quid pro quo. I'm doing my story. I'm not doing your book. And then I eventually confronted Vince with the same information, and he went absolutely ballistic. It's all in the book. So, it was a lot of events like that over the course of 15, 20 years that made me keep pushing forward and trying to get more and more answers.
Right, and this is just to recap. This is crazy because the reason this is so explosive is because the official account is that Terry is like scared to death of the Manson family, but instead he's actually going to see them after the murders. I mean,
Yeah.
that was
Well,
one of the craziest pieces of the whole book.
one of the interviews I found in the sheriff's files was from Paul Watkins, who was one of Manson's right-hand man, who wasn't a killer. He wasn't with the family when the murders happened. He was living in Death Valley. Manson had sent him there to kind of prepare where they were going to go and live with them there. But he kept coming back, and he'd actually come back, I think, for a physical for the draft in September of '69 after the murders happened. He told the sheriffs that when he was at the ranch that one day after the physical, he went to see the people who were left there. Melcher was there and he was on his knees crying. He was high on LSD and he was begging Charlie for forgiveness. And he was saying, Manson said to Charlie, they all had to die. All those piggies had to die. And here's what's so frustrating about doing this kind of reporting. So the sheriff who took the interview was dead, so I couldn't ask him. There was no audio tape that I could find. It was just his notes. I couldn't ask him what that meant. I only had like that paragraph. Melcher on his knees begging for forgiveness. Charlie saying, no, no, they all had to die. All the piggies had to die. The second partner was alive. I found him. He said he didn't remember it, but there's a whole backstory to why I don't believe that. And Paul Watkins, who gave the information to the sheriffs, was dead. So I couldn't ask him what that meant. And Manson, I interviewed him, but I couldn't ask him anything specific about anything because he would just start talking in riddles and crazy
Right.
Charlie answers. So I could never fill out that, what really happened. All I had was like a half a page of notes from the sheriff from Paul Watkins.
So let's talk about Manson a little bit and who he was. So Manson, before the murders, he's a aspiring artist, as you said. He gets turned down by I apologize, not Brian Wilson, Brian Wilson's brother, the other Beach Boy. Dennis, thank you. He wants to be a musician. He's obsessed with the Beatles, but he's also a career criminal. And so let's get into some of the theories around this, because he is a criminal. He's out on parole. He doesn't act like a guy who's out on parole. He keeps committing crimes. He keeps getting in trouble, and he never faces the music for any of this. He never gets put back in prison. There's always somebody to make it disappear when he does something that a normal person on parole would get sent back to prison for. I guess I'll just ask why.
Another big why I couldn't answer. I mean, he had a
Give us,
parole officer.
I know you don't have a conclusive, but like get some of the theories around this.
He had a get out of jail free card. He was paroled to Los Angeles in 1967 in March, immediately violated his parole, and without permission went to the Bay Area and reported to the parole office there. And they wrote to the LA office saying, this guy just showed up. We looked in the record and he's supposed to be with you. He wants to live here and we don't want him. We need to send him back to you. And then they requested, well, since he's up there, why don't you just take him? Now, normally, if you or I had done that, it's a violation. They would have sent us back. He'd been in prison for 17 years of his life at that point. He was half of his life. He was like 33, 34. In prison and federal institutions as a teenage criminal. So reform schools, juvenile detention places, all federally run. And then as soon as he was out, he got arrested a couple months later for obstructing an officer who was trying to arrest the same girl I spoke about earlier, Ruth Ann Morehouse, who was in a cabin with him in Northern California, and her mother was trying to get her away from Manson. She was 15, and Manson physically wouldn't let her be arrested. And he pled guilty to that, was given, I think, 3 years, 3 days in jail for time served while he was waiting trial, and then 3 years of probation. Now, his parole officer sort of automatically violated his parole, sent him back. But not only didn't he do that, but he rewarded him by dismissing the probation. He didn't have to do the 3 years of probation, and then asked his superiors in DC to let Manson go to Mexico because Manson thought he had two job opportunities. Twice the parole officer tried to send him to a different country where he'd have no supervision at all. And it was the last country that he was arrested in 1961 before he went to prison for 7 years or 6 years. He was deported because he was a criminal there, possibly involved in a murder. So that continued from 67 until the Tate LaBianca murders. He kept getting arrested, released, or arrested, released, minor stuff like car theft, serious stuff like rape, assault, being in the possession of automatic weapons, a machine gun. He even had so much, he was so fearless, a carbine or whatever the bullets for a machine. I'm not a gun person, but that a machine gun has that thing that feeds the bullets in. He lost them on his doom buckies. He found out the sheriff's department had them, and he went down there and said, I want my machine gun bullets back. This is a guy on federal parole. So he had immunity, and the theory I present in the book, and it's complicated to get into here, but they needed Manson out because he was part of a research project, an experiment that the government was doing with criminals like him, and it kind of wasn't, I don't believe, the end results were planned, but it became rogue and ended in the horrible murders of quite a few people.
And I assume the program you're talking about is there's a program called MK Ultra, which you do a lot of reporting on.
There's actually
It's
there's actually
oh,
three
go ahead.
programs that were run simultaneously: Chaos by the CIA, MK Ultra by the CIA, and COINTELPRO by the FBI, that all kind of merged in the theory I present, where they were trying to neutralize the left-wing movement in 1968-69 because it was identified by first President Lyndon Johnson and then Governor Ronald Reagan and Mayor Sam Yorty. This is just in California, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and the head of the CIA, Richard Helms, as the biggest threat to American security, national security, was this anti-war, hippie, left-wing, and also Black Power movement that they thought was going to, kind of like now, undermine the Constitution and cause a civil war, and they were trying to stop it. And COINTELPRO and Chaos specifically were infiltrating left-wing groups and trying to set them up to either be killed by rivals or by their own law enforcement by pushing them to commit a crime and then killing them in the process, or arresting them, or having rival groups kill them and smear them and make them look bad to the general public, which is kind of what happened after Manson and the family were identified as the killers of the Tate and LaBiancas. This group of hippies, as the country had gotten to know these long-haired, beaded, young people who seemed harmless and silly, all of a sudden became boogeymen who would come into your house at night and stab you to death and hang you and leave blood writing on your walls.
So you said you don't think their end goal was to have the Tate LaBianca murders occur. That's not what they set
Well,
out
I
to
don't know.
do.
It's an opinion.
What do you?
It's an
Go ahead.
That's an opinion. I mean, I can't imagine that they wanted, this poor actress who was like 3 weeks away from having her baby to be stabbed 15 times, with her fetus and left to bleed to death on our living room floor after they hung her briefly from the ceiling. But I did ask someone who knew a lot more about these programs than I did, who was a academic at Hastings College. He taught law. He also had a medical degree. And he had written one of the most kind of thoroughly vetted and complete books about the programs called The Mind Manipulators. It came out in like 77 or 78. I presented all the information I had to him, and I said, do you think this was an MK Ultra experiment gone wrong? And he said, I think it was an Ultra experiment gone right, that's exactly what they wanted to happen. So I'm kind of in the middle. I don't know, and whether they wanted that outcome. It sure served the purposes of Chaos and COINTELPRO. I mean, after those murders, people wouldn't pick up hitchhikers. They would, they got their kids to stay away from hippies. The hippies are bad. They're dangerous. They'll kill you when they're tripping on LSD.
Why do you think so Manson gets arrested for these murders? And you touched on it. Most of the time when we think of a murder case that has some conspiracy behind it that we don't know about, it usually involves that they arrested the wrong person. That's not the case here. The right people got arrested. Manson spends the rest of his life in prison. but he's always, you got to talk to him a little bit. He always says very odd, he doesn't confirm it. He'll just say things like, I've seen him talk where he'll be like, the truth will come out. Why didn't he just say what the truth was? Why didn't he share anything?
Well, that's it's hard to say this without sounding like a conspiracy person. Once he was in prison after the murders, he was sent to Vacaville, and that was, I think, 72. So he was arrested and tried through 71 for he was involved in like 5 different murder trials, the Tate LaBianca, and then the individual trial of Tex Watson for Tate LaBianca, and then the murder of Shorty Shea, who was killed by Manson and some of the men, and Gary Hinman. And by the time he was put into the federal system, he went to Vacaville, which was an MK Ultra lab where they were playing with people's brains and memories there with drugs. And from that point forward, he became really incomprehensible
Hmm.
once he was there. So did they mess up with his memory then? It sounds like a convenient excuse. Another thing is Manson always said he would never be a snitch, that, he was raised in the jails and with convicts, and the worst thing you can do is snitch on anybody else. He liked the notoriety he had. He didn't want to be released from prison in 67. He said, "This is my home. It's all I've known. I want to be here." And he wouldn't sign his release forms. He begged to stay in. And everybody even Roger Smith, his first parole officer, said he'd rather be back in prison than free. So maybe that's what all he ever wanted, and to be this superstar, in the world of notorious monsters.
So if he didn't,
Or
okay,
he didn't
so
know,
there's
or he
one
was
theory.
completely just
He had just lost his mind. You're saying like he just didn't remember anything, or he was just
or
off the deep end.
he didn't have any idea, or he didn't know what was going on, he didn't know how he was being manipulated. I mean, he did say, and I'm very careful about quoting him, but he had his first parole hearings, I think, in either late 70s or early 80s. And I've got a collection of about 3 or 4 different parole hearings. He stopped going to them in the, I think, late 90s. He wouldn't go anymore. But he did talk about doctors from the Navy coming to see him and experimenting on him before he was released in 67. And he said that they played with his mind. He also said that he was an informant, that he had to get, I mean, a lot of stuff that I would write in my book, he says, but, he says that, in the middle of all this other gibberish, it's hard to give it too much weight because he would say anything that came
Hmm.
onto his mind. And it's possible to tell what he's saying because he means it or because he doesn't understand what he's saying.
So there's one theory that the gentleman you spoke to, that the CIA got exactly what they wanted out of this.
Yeah.
The alternative, if we want to imagine that they didn't want this actress and others to be slaughtered in their home, would be that it went wrong. So ultimately, what went wrong? I guess the outcome, perhaps, that they would have wanted would be they would have infiltrated a different group and done something like this, or what does that even mean? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. Then I start going off on different speculative stuff. I mean, Sharon Tate's mother was convinced that the killers thought Sharon was away that night. Her car was at the shop, and she was supposed to be spending the night at her friend Sheila Wells' house. And Sharon Tate's mother, Doris, who immersed herself in the murders like 5 years after they happened, when she finally could kind of get out of bed, in interviews said, "I believe that the house was surveilled. I believe that the killers were, my daughter wasn't the victim, that they were sent there to kill someone else." And she also said the truth is going to come out. Now, another weird angle to all this is her husband was in military intelligence,
Whose
and
husband is
he
this?
retired. Sharon Tate's father, Doris Tate's husband, Colonel
Got
Paul
it. Okay.
Tate. Yeah, and his last day of work, he was retiring, was the day that was a Saturday, was Friday. He was in San Francisco at Fort Bragg or Fort Baker out in the Bay Area. He had already moved the family, his wife and 2 other daughters, to San Pedro like a month before. And on that Saturday, he was moving down there to start his retirement years. And he ended up investigating the case himself undercover. And there's a lot about him in the book, which is hard to get into because it's a whole other hour of conversation. But he had a lot of information that he shared with his wife, and that's what she was using, but he would never talk publicly about it. And I tried very hard. It's in the book. I got him on the phone 2 or 3 times and he'd always hang up on me. I was never able to get an interview with him. So it's a murky world, the
Yeah.
whole world of this case.
Yeah, and this house that they're at, I mean, this is late 60s LA. I mean, that this is the home of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, who's one of the biggest directors in Hollywood at the time. But it's the way you describe it, it's almost like picture like the party house in like there's just people coming and going from there. There's like biker gangs, Hollywood elites. Like you would never have something like this today where the elite you don't have these random like wannabe rockers and biker gangs and stuff showing up and partying with movie stars, but that was late 60s LA.
Yeah, late 60s LA was the end of the studio system. So all of a sudden, independent films were being made by people like Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda, Easy Rider. Walls were coming down. The Henry Fondas, who actually lived at that house in the guest house for a few years, the Cary Grants and stuff, their era was over. And now it was the free love, communal drug taking, all that. So they had their guard down. And this house in particular was like the epicenter of left wing kind of Hollywood royalty because of Roman and Sharon's residency. But what made it more exasperated was Roman and Sharon left. They moved in I think February of 69. And then in the middle of March, they'd only been there 6 weeks. Roman went to London to scout locations for Day of the Dolphin, book that he was going to direct. And Sharon went to Europe to make a movie about Satanism and witchcraft. So they were gone from March until Sharon came back July. And they asked two of their friends who became two of the victims, Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress, and her boyfriend, Wojciech Prokowski, who was an aspiring director, cinematographer, Polish friend of Roman's, to house sit. And those two brought in this really unseen crew of people who were hardcore drug users, sellers. Doris Tate believed that they were the targets because she thought there was evidence that at least Wojciech was selling drugs out of the house. And they were letting much seedier people in than even Roman and Sharon had let into the house. And then Sharon came back in the middle of all that and was, from the interviews I did with her friends, was really unhappy and was begging Roman to either throw Abigail and Wojciech out. And he said, no, you're safer there than being alone in that house. It's too isolated. And I'll be back. He kept putting off his return. And I mean, he was cutting it really close because she was due the middle of August. And, her friends described, her crying to them saying, he won't come back. And I don't want these people here. And he thinks, she said, why won't he come back and take care of me? I'm about to have my baby. So she had to live amidst all that for, I think she got back the day of the moon landing or the day before, which was like July 20th. So she was there about 3.5, 4 weeks with this crew of gross people.
Yeah, imagine leaving your pregnant wife with that crew of people, which you can, Roman Polanski, he's still alive today, is
Yeah.
living abroad because he can't come back to the US or he'll be arrested. So he wasn't exactly a stand up
Yeah.
individual himself. And there's theories around him at all. I mean, I don't know, is there any universe where he knew something?
I always, I think he knows a lot more about what was going on than he's ever let on. I've never interviewed him. I had an opportunity once and I blew it. It wasn't the right time for me to do it. I was going to have to go over there and then the window closed and it was too late. It's one of my other regrets. Not that I would have gotten him to tell me anything or admit anything, but I had some really important important questions to ask him that he'd never been asked. But yeah, I leave my mind's open about the fact that there's more to his story connected to this case than we've ever known. As soon as they arrested that group, he left Los Angeles and didn't come back until they were all in prison a couple years later, and rarely speaks about them. And, it's hard. The guy survived the Holocaust as a teenager. He lost almost all his family. He had a really hard life, but, he turned into somebody who was pretty cruel. In my book, I document him being verbally and physically abusive to Sharon. He ended up getting convicted of drugging and raping, I think she was a 13, 14-year-old girl, which is why he fled the country before his jail sentence was going to begin and has never been back here since whenever that was, 77 or something, 78. Very talented director, but yeah, he's still alive, living in Paris. I think he's about 90 or 91 now. But another mystery, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the story, like you said, the story's full of loose ends and mysteries, and there's a lot of theories. There's a lot of directions you can take it. I guess I should ask you. I know it's not official yet, but with the second book, I know you're already researching it. But where did you start? Where were you immediately like, this is where I need to pick up where I left off?
For the second one,
The second
it's
one.
probably going to begin. Yeah, yeah. A lot of it is what was going on with Manson in prison before 1967. A lot of
Have
it.
you found
And then yeah, I found new information. I can't really talk about it here. And then
nothing?
also
No,
other
no
stuff
teasers.
about nothing right now that I'm comfortable sharing, but let's just say some pretty intriguing documents have come my way.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
I'll
we
leave it
will
at that.
all. Yeah, fair enough. I'll. Yeah, we'll leave it hanging a little bit because I know I'm very excited for hopefully when the second book comes out. Tom, I do want to be respectful of your time. I know we had about an hour to do this, but
Sure.
is there anything else you want to be sure that we get to here before we let you go?
Yeah, I don't like to bash, the documentary that was made on me in the book that I was involved with, but because it just sounds like sour grapes. I sound like a baby, but I get frustrated over and over again when people see that documentary and they say to me, why did you make it? And I didn't make it. It was made by a very good director who promised me something that wasn't delivered. So I just urge people, I don't care if they see it or not, it's on Netflix. I just urge people to read the book and they can take or leave the film, and again, I like Daryl, the director, but he really kind of pulled the rug out from under me and did a disservice to my book and to my 20 years of work.
So I intentionally didn't watch the documentary before interviewing you because I just wanted to talk about the book and not have a different I guess storyline or anything in my head. What didn't you like about it?
Everything. It didn't cover any. It was 90 minutes long. Vince Bugliosi isn't even mentioned till the last 10 minutes. Jolly West, Reeve Whitson's not mentioned. David Smith, the head of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, it just omitted the most powerful material in the book and the most exciting information in the book. Very superficial, and it gives a platform to a guy named Bobby Beausoleil, who's one of the family members who went to prison for the murder of Gary Hinman. And Errol allowed him to pontificate and tell lies about the murders, why they happened, how they happened, which have been disproven again and again and again at all of his parole hearings. And it's an embarrassment to me. And I quit the project about 6 months before it came out. So, I mean, believe me, I'm not the only one saying this. People say to me, how could Errol Morris is one of the best documentary filmmakers in the world. He won an Oscar for Fog of War. Everyone says, what happened? Was he a limited hangout? How could he take a book and so ruin it and make everything that's good about it boring? And I don't know. It's as big a mystery to me as the mysteries in my book is why this guy made such a shitty film. And I hate saying
I
this now in a public
Yeah.
forum, but because it just sounds, I mean, there's no way an author can sound anything but like a big baby saying, my book was so much better. But 99% of the people that see the book say, what happened? That there's nothing in that film that resembles your book.
I wonder if it
But I'll
was
be
just an
interested in
easier.
hearing what you think.
Yeah, I wonder if it was just Netflix just decided it was an easier thing to pitch to the public, that we got one of the guys who was in prison and he's going to tell the story is like I don't even know. It
No, no,
doesn't.
no, because he didn't get that guy until he was almost finished. He didn't get it until he was halfway through making it. but it had already been decided they were only going to have it at 90 minutes. He threw Bobby in at the middle without telling me. He was supposed to talk to me before he interviewed anyone so I could give him questions. And he deliberately withheld that from me, and it was too late. And I'm like, he's just lying. I mean, I can disprove A, B, C, D, and E. He's just lying. Do not let him articulate that in the film. You're going to look bad. I'm going to look bad. But he did. And anybody that knows the case, go on all the on all the YouTube places that and they think that because I'm in it that I had any kind of creative control over it. No, I quit the thing. I wanted nothing to do with it. I wish I would just vanish.
Hmm.
And that's the
So as
most I've
far
ever said about it. So that's your exclusion.
there we go. Got an exclusive today. So as far as stuff that you're working on, you mentioned the second book hopefully is coming together. You also mentioned you might be doing your own podcast series. Is that something that's in the works?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure what's going on with it, but I did tape of hours and hours and hours with Rick Rubin, the music producer,
Yeah,
and
legend.
that's
Yeah.
supposedly in the can and being edited. Yeah, so I'm waiting to hear what's going to happen with that. We did that in the spring, and he's releasing that. I think he's famous for being very cryptic and mysterious and
Mhm.
zen. So I still don't know how long it is. I know we taped 5 or 6 days, like 6 or 8 hours a day. I did a podcast with him. He has his own podcast where he interviews
Mhm.
someone for 2 hours. And I did his podcast about 2 years ago. And we had met a year or two before that. And he was really interested in the book. So, I mean, you can hear the podcast I did with him if you go to his platform. And it's good. I mean, he's a really good interviewer and I like him, but I'm not sure what's happening with this whole separate entity that he's created. I'm waiting to hear. I was told they want to release it in September, which is now, but I haven't heard anything like it's being released. So who knows? I think it's a little too much of me talking. I'm tired of listening to myself. I try not to even do podcasts anymore, but that's in the can. So if it's going to happen, I think if you don't see it in the next couple months, maybe they threw it away. Who knows?
Huh. Well, I'll look forward to that one. And I know you said you don't do a ton of podcasts, so it was an honor to have you on today. Is there? But I always ask people.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I always ask people before we let them go, is there anywhere that you'd like to tell people where they can follow along with you and anything that you're releasing or writing or anything else you want to shout out before we let you go?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have an Instagram page. I have an Instagram and a Facebook that has lots of, either slideshows of documents, and then I make these really amateurish videos of using audios of my interviews and video stuff. Just with the caveat is I don't know what I'm doing. I'm really bad technically, and I keep meaning to hire someone, but the idea of having to delegate all that to someone who's going to make it just look sassier and quicker and more professional. I'd rather have my stuff be authentic. So that's all on my social media, Facebook and Instagram. Rick wants me to create a Substack page, so I
Yeah.
might be putting a lot from there over to Substack. I actually did the page a couple of years ago, but I think there's one post on it and people started subscribing. And then I got horrified because I'm like, oh, wait, if they're paying, then they expect stuff like every week or something. So I disabled the subscriptions. But if I launch it with Rick, then I'm probably going to take a small subscription price and just for people getting exclusive access before it becomes public, like a week early or something. But I haven't even decided about that. So for now, if they just go to my Facebook or my Instagram, they can see a lot of stuff that's it's kind of enough stuff in the book. I mean, people who are obsessives like it because they get to see documents and photos. They get to hear some of the explosive audio interviews and things like that.
All right. Well, if you're listening today, everybody go get the book. The book is, of course, called Chaos. Incredible. Like we only covered a fraction of it today. So go get the book, read it, buy Tom's next book if and when it comes out. And yeah, Tom, thanks again for making time for us today. This has been a blast.
Thanks, Matt. I enjoyed it.
That is a wrap for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Saucetown Investor. If you got value from this, drop us a comment and let us know your thoughts. Did you have a big takeaway? Is there a topic you want to see us cover next time? Is there a guest you want to see interviewed? DMs are open. Business is at Saucetown Properties, and my personal, you can DM me personally, is at The Real Matt Cox 4. We'd also like to ask you kindly to please like and subscribe. You can also follow along with the Saucetown Investor blog. That's mattcox444.substack.com. Thanks again, guys, and until next time, keep investing and stay saucy, Saucetown.